Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of the Portulans Institute Academic Partner Spotlight Series. Today, we are joined by Professor Ravi Kanbur, the T.H. Lee Professor of World Affairs and International Professor of Applied Economics and Management and Professor of Economics at Cornell University. Professor Kanbur, thank you so much for joining us today, and please go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed, Sylvie. It's a pleasure to be with you and pleasure to be with the Portland Institute. I suppose, I was born and brought up in India for the first 13 years or so of my life. And then my parents migrated to England. So I did my education, high school education and university education in England. I was in British academia for about 10 years. And then I joined the World Bank. And I was in the World Bank for about 10 years, including being stationed as the chief of the office in Ghana in West Africa, and I was also the chief economist for the whole of sub-Saharan Africa at the World Bank. And then Cornell made me an offer I couldn't refuse, so I came to Ithaca, and I've been there ever since, and I've been very happy at Cornell.
Great, thank you for that introduction. And now we can jump into some questions about your research. So as you mentioned, you have extensive research experience and experience working with organizations all around the world. Could you tell us a bit more about your research on innovation, particularly technological innovation and its impacts on inequality?
Yes, indeed. This is something that I've written about and thought about for quite a while. A question is asked often, are we living in an age of rising inequality? And this certainly appears to be the case if you look, for example, at conventional inequality data for the US, for China, for India, for Europe, and so on and so forth. So conventionally measured economic inequality is rising in many of these countries. Okay, and you ask yourself the question, why is it rising in many of these countries? And there are many reasons, of course, but one of the major trends globally is the trend of labor-saving technical change, or innovation, as some people would call it. What this particular aspect of innovation in this particular case is that it displaces basic labor in favor of more skilled labor and in favor of capital. And you don't need fancy economics to see what the consequences of that are. You displace basic labor. So if in fact labor markets are such that puts downward pressure on wages will fall. If, on the other hand, wages don't fall, there'll be high unemployment. So if you compare US and Spain, for example, in the US, median wages have barely moved in the last 30 years. In Spain, where wages are rigid, youth unemployment is very, very high indeed. So one way or the other, this is going to hit you, and it's going to be reflected in the inequality data, either because of low wages or because of high unemployment. One way or the other, it's going to hit you. Okay. And I believe that this has been a feature of the last 30, 40, 50 years. And by the way, I should say this is very different from, for example, the era in which countries like South Korea had their big growth spurts in the 1960s and 70s. You'll all 50s, 60s, and 70s. You'll all recall those black and white film reels of factories, shoe factories, where hundreds and thousands of workers doing shoe type stuff. Okay, well now all that's replaced by 3 people behind a glass panel. That's been the impact. So what was available to South Korea 60 years ago is not available now because innovation, technological change has moved on. So I believe, there are many other reasons, but I believe this is one of the reasons why inequality is indeed rising in many of these countries. Now, I have to say that inequality has not been rising everywhere all the time. Over the last 25, 30 years, there have been periods of 10, 15 years in regions of the world like Latin America, where, again, inequality measured in the same way, similar data, etc., has actually been falling, when it was rising in the US, rising in etc., etc. And the question is why? Why, with the same trends, the same technological things and so on, it's rising in one part of the world and falling in another part of the world? Okay, and the answer has to be policy. Government policy was different in these 2 settings. In one setting, in fact, not only did the government not do anything to address the issues, maybe government policy even exacerbated the trends towards rising inequality. Whereas in Latin America, in those years, okay, I'm not saying this is a perfect story. In the years that I'm talking about, in fact, government through its policies of education policies, of minimum wage policies, and so on and so forth, countered this trend, these inequality trends. So I think that's a lesson that policy matters in these settings. Now, I would also say that it's not all a negative story, in the sense that technological innovation in countries like China, in countries like India, and so on, has indeed pushed those countries up on average closer to the US. So that dimension of world inequality has reduced. Even though inequality within these countries has risen, on average, those countries have moved closer to the US and Europe. And that dimension of world inequality, if you like, has actually gone down. So it's a complex, it's a nuanced story. It's not, but the main lesson I want to take away from this is two things. Firstly, there is this exogenous, there is this trend, this global trend towards labor displacing technical innovation. And how governments counter that, how governments address that, is what determines the outcome. And there are different ways in which governments can address it. Some have done well at it, others have not done so well at it. And maybe we can talk in detail about some of those policies as we go along.
You mentioned the effect of policy on the inequality landscape and actions being taken by governments. Can we talk a little bit more in detail about some present-day policy challenges when it comes to innovation and inequality?
Yes, indeed. So let's start again with this notion that innovation is happening, and my focus has been, and I think our focus has to be, on labor displacing innovation that displaces basic labor. Now, of course, in 50 years' time, 60 years' time, things will be, I suppose you could argue, things will be fine. Okay. After all, things were displaced when the railways came, when this happened, when the electricity came, when the internal combustion engine came, et cetera, et cetera. But over a period of half a century or whatever, things evened out and things were better overall. But what we're faced with politically and ethically is the current situation over the next 20 to 30 to 40 years. What are we going to do about those people who are displaced by this labor-saving innovation? Okay. And I suppose you could say that 60, 70 years ago, you didn't need to worry. The political systems weren't of the type that you needed to worry about those people. But now they come onto the streets, they vote, they bring in populist parties, they bring in all sorts of policy instincts in the population. So I think we have to worry about rising inequality as a result of labor-saving technical change. Now, there are a couple of responses to this. The way that labor-saving technical change works, as I said, is that it displaces basic labor in favor of skilled labor, in favor of educated labor, and indeed of capital as well. Well, one natural response to this is to therefore work on the supply side of the labor market, to actually improve and increase the skills of the population, so that when basic labor is displaced in favor of skilled labor, the skilled labor is there to take on that role. The problem arises if you can't make that transformation quick enough. If you can't, just think about it. If you started today to change the education system and so on and so forth, it'll take 15 years for a kid who enters schooling today, 18 years, to actually achieve all those things. And then there has to be training and so on, even beyond that. So this is immediate. This is not like it won't happen overnight. Over a 15 to 20-year period, you have to keep at it. So that's one major policy lesson. You can address this thing by working, so to speak, on the supply side of labor, because what labor-saving technical change does is that it affects the demand side of labor. It reduces the demand for basic labor in favor of skilled labor, as I said. So you can sort of try to build up skills, and that's absolutely the right policy to follow. But one shouldn't think that it'll work overnight. In fact, it may not work for half a generation, and you then have to face up to those consequences. So given that, it seems to me that if current trends continue, despite, and indeed this is what Latin American governments did, they countered using these sorts of policies. But despite that, there'll be this underlying trend to increase inequality. And it seems to me then that one has no choice, I don't think, but to think about redistribution, but to think about supporting those who are displaced by this labor-saving technical change. And where's the resources going to come from? Just think of a 40-year-old steel worker who has been put out of a job in the Midwest of the US, not because the job has gone to China, but because technology has moved on. As I said, there are now 3 people behind a glass screen and doing all of that sort of stuff. Okay. And the notion that you could overnight transform this 40-year-old steel worker into a computer programmer is fanciful. Okay. You may, of course, you can do a little bit, and people, there are these schemes available, but one has to be clear that something will have to be done for that 40-year-old steel worker who will be with us for the next 40 years. Okay. So the notion of other types of jobs and so on, those are all good discussions to be having. And that's what I think policy innovation, talking about innovation now, not in terms of technological innovation, but policy innovation, we have to think to ourselves, what are we going to do with that 40-year-old steel worker who has been made unemployed because of technological innovation? That to me is the question to ask, is the right question to ask for policy innovators who are also innovators, who are no less innovators than those who think of a new robotic scheme or whatever it is. Okay. So these 2 things, working on the supply side in terms of education, and then thinking about what you do for that big mass of people who cannot be helped by transformation in terms of technical skills, etc., or can only be helped very, very slowly. So it seems to me, at any rate, that whether you like it or not, redistribution of some sort, if you like, if I could put it in illustrative terms, taxing the computer programmers to provide support for the steelworker, that has to be part of the solution. That has to be part of the answer. Now, I know economists know a lot about how not to do this sort of redistribution. We know that there are bad ways of doing it, and there are better ways of doing it. So none of this is to say that we shouldn't be having those discussions, how to do things right. But we have to face up to the fact that some redistribution will be required if the current pace of innovation is to continue. Otherwise, there'll be a backlash against it.
Yes, that's very interesting. And when you mentioned reskilling and upskilling populations and the human equation of this, it brought me back to discussions that were had around the Network Readiness Index, which we published this year, which was, of course, about digital natives. But one kind of topic that was talked about in some of the events was, what are we going to do with these populations that are now left out as a result of this digital transformation? Because it is not affecting everyone equally. And, digital immigrants, so to say, are now somewhat at a disadvantage in that respect. Now, my next question is about COVID. So you're talking about future trends in innovation and inequality and the results of labor displacement. Of course, we can't talk about technological innovation and labor displacement without mentioning the digitalization that was pushed forward by the COVID pandemic. So could you tell us a little bit about how the COVID pandemic played into this equation and how this could affect the trajectory of global inequality in the coming years?
So before I talk about the digitalization aspects of COVID and its impacts on inequality, which in some sense I think follow from my earlier arguments, let's talk about the impact of differential vaccination rates and differential recovery rates in the world, and its impact on overall evolution of incomes and inequalities in the world as a whole. Okay. And some work that Andy Sumner and I have just recently put out, it really provides some quite startling findings. That if we sort of apply some sort of if you like, a projection of what has happened in the last 3 years of the pandemic to the next 5-7 years in terms of recovery of the economy and the vaccination rates of the population, et cetera, we actually have very sobering results that, in fact, world inequality as a whole, overall world inequality as a whole, may well begin to turn up in the next 5 to 10 years. See, what has happened over the last 30, 40 years is that these two forces on inequality that I mentioned earlier, one is that inequality within countries has been rising, but inequality between countries, like China and the US, has been falling because China has caught up with the US, okay? And those two forces have resolved in such a way that, in fact, world inequality has fallen, okay? Our projections for the next 7 to 10 years suggest that even that silver lining, if you like, is going to turn out to be a cloud. That, in fact, global inequality will actually rise over the next begin to rise over the next 7 to 10 years, as soon as the next 5 to 7 to 10 years. Okay, so that's in terms of again the public policy response to COVID, vaccination rates, the hoarding of vaccines, all of that sort of stuff. In our view, is by itself is going to contribute to rising inequality over the last 7 to 10 years, reversing one of the silver linings that we've had over the last 30 years or so. Now, you talked also about the increased digitalization that COVID has brought about. Okay? Now I have to confess that this is not an area where I've done detailed research myself, so I couldn't quote my own work in detail. But I think it stands to reason that digitalization, for the very reasons that you alluded to earlier, Sylvie, the lack of integration, the lack of whatever, will have disequalizing effects. That those people who are already integrated into the digitalized world will, of course, benefit from the increased digitalization of production. Has to be. But those who are excluded from that will, almost by definition, cannot benefit from the increased digitalization. So let us accept, and there's empirical work to show that there has been increased digitalization as a result of COVID for obvious reasons. Okay, for obvious reasons it has happened. But again, I would say that the impact of that on inequality, when, of course, there are pluses and minuses, and we can all talk about the exceptions and so on and so forth. But overall, I would say its impact on inequality has been it's been a force towards increasing inequality. Okay, precisely for the reasons that you alluded to, which is the lack of integration of major sections of the population into the digital sphere. So that would be my view on COVID. In some sense, not good news. Perhaps good news for innovation. And maybe the effects of that innovation over a 50-year period will pay off, as indeed they have in the past paid off. But over the next 10 years, which is a relevant, to me, is a relevant horizon for us to think about from an ethical standpoint, and certainly from a political standpoint, the situation is not quite so rosy.
Yes, thank you for those thoughts, and also for highlighting how interdisciplinary these issues are and how many moving parts there are to these equations that we're thinking about. So that is actually all the questions I have for you today. It has been really great speaking with you today, Professor Kanbur, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on innovation and inequality and digitalization and so forth with us. These are, of course, very important conversations to have as the pace of innovation continues to increase and the world continues to change at such a fast pace. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you, Sylvie. It was a pleasure. And if there was a final thought that I would leave you with, which is this I'm sure has been absorbed by the GII network as a whole, which is that innovation is not simply a technical matter. It's not simply a technical matter. There are huge social dimensions to it, and in fact, as I said, policy innovation is no less innovation than technological innovation. Thank you.